I'm going to talk about the economics of free-to-play games, because what we're seeing in industries such as SaaS is really just echoing what has already happened in the video game industry. Now, I work for some very credible video game companies such as Sony PlayStation and Ironclad Games, so I have a good sense of how these things play out in the real world. Now, in the 90s, when you would buy a video game magazine, often what you would get was a physical disc, a demo disc. And this demo disc had little samples of video games that hadn't yet been released, or perhaps they were and you could go buy them. And the idea was you would play a little version or a little mini game, maybe the first level, or something a little more fabricated to give you a taste of what the game is like, to entice you to go and purchase it. Now, essentially today, that's what we might call a free trial. We don't really refer to that as a demo. A demo is usually a one-on-one conversation with a salesperson. Now, sometimes we do see demo-like experiences that are not one-on-one conversations. They're more interactive. Maybe it's a sandbox experience, something like that. But one of the biggest transformations that has happened in the video game industry already is the movement towards free-to-play, essentially a freemium model. Now, when you have a free-to-play game, you have two major groups of people. You have one tiny group that is a tiny fraction of your overall user base. These are the people that actually pay for things, and usually they pay for things on a recurring basis, or they buy things periodically so that it kind of manifests as a recurring purchase. The other group is a much, much larger, and these are people that are not paying you with money. So you have the small group of people that have money, and then maybe they don't have a lot of time. But then you have the much larger group that doesn't have a lot of money, or at least isn't spending money, but they do have a lot of time. And both of these groups of people create value for your company and for your product and for each other. So let's look at the first group. Now, it's very obvious how they create value. They give you money. And they're also part of the user experience for the second group. So there's some value created there as well. The second group is a little more complicated because they're not paying for anything. How are they creating value for you? Well, one thing that they're doing is they're making the community better. The experience of using the product is better because there are more people using it. And the people that are paying are more willing to pay when there are other people creating value in the community in the game. Okay, another thing that happens is there are network effects that get created. So the second group, the larger group, helps create those network effects because they're a much larger group, they have more weight behind them. The other thing that they do is they create economies of scale. So the value that you invest in your product is dispersed among a much wider group of people. Other things that they do is generate word of mouth and essentially create that kind of virality that you want for your product. So the free-to-play gaming economics works essentially because it is the engine of economies of scale. And what we know from economics and business strategy is that economies of scale is essentially the strongest competitive advantage you can possibly have. So you can see why other industries outside of gaming are moving towards product-led growth, freemium types of models. And why does that work? Well, it's the most fundamental economics of supply and demand. When you drop the price of something, the demand surges. And when you drop the price to zero, you've basically maximized the demand for your product, the amount of people that are willing to use it, to install it, etc. So again, it's that concept of how do we make the top of funnel as wide as possible so that that tiny fraction of people that do end up paying becomes as large as it can be. Now, the thing that we learn from free-to-play games is that it doesn't work in all cases. There are still games that you pay for, and those are games that are too niche. For example, you don't have huge scale. The economies of scale just can't happen with a free-to-play model or a freemium model. And it doesn't work well with certain types of single-player games because with single-player games, network effects aren't as important. There's not that recurring multiplayer experience and the engagement. There is some engagement offline through word of mouth and stuff, but not to the tight examples that we see with lots of multiplayer games. So freemium doesn't always work in gaming, and it doesn't always work outside of gaming. Later I'm going to discuss an article from Jason Lampkin talking about what kind of scale you need to make freemium work. Okay, So the main takeaways from the free-to-play gaming economics. It can help you make you a blockbuster. It can unlock the floodgates, open a wider experience for lots of people, and make your product a huge hit. It can help with that anyways. So if your product has mass appeal, that can work. Doesn't work so well when you're dealing with a super niche because you're dealing with smaller groups of people. You're not going to get those big economics advantages. The other thing that's important is that you need to think about the non-paying users. Are they creating value? And they can create value in different ways. Are they going to generate word of mouth? If they're not, then your product-led growth with a freemium model doesn't really make sense. Are they contributing to network effects and customer captivity? Is it harder for paying users to leave your product because there are lots of non-paying users that kind of make them feel stuck to it? This happens a lot with communications things like Slack and Skype and Facebook Messenger, etc. The other thing that you need to think about is there a better community because the community is bigger? Or because there are a lot of people that aren't willing to pay for it, but can contribute more to that community centered around your product. Now, the last big learning that I want you to take away from this is you can look to the video game industry as the frontier, as a predictor of what may happen in other industries with product-led growth.